I'm excited for this season of Rocket Motivation because my firm, Hand, Arundel, Harrison Sale, Attorneys at Law, where I am a partner, is our sponsor. We understand life and running a business can be challenging, but with the right support, it can also be incredibly rewarding. That's why we're thrilled to announce our partnership with Hand, Arundel, Harrison Sale.
This too shall pass. Those are the 4 wisest words ever written. And that's because it seems like things are bad. It will get better. Suicide is a permanent solution to a temporary problem. There's both help and there's relief. The relief will also come with time. You will get through this. This is another cliche, but one day you will look back on all this and maybe not laugh, but say to yourself, wow, I got through that. And if I can get through that, I can get through anything.
Hey everyone, this is Rod Cate and welcome to Rocket Motivation Podcast. This week's guest's father was a Korean War veteran who took his own life just after this week's guest's 16th birthday. This week's guest will talk about how the loss of his father affected him and how it prepared him for life in his career. This week's guest was a trader on the iconic commodities exchange trading floors, and we'll talk about that experience and the life lessons he's learned. He's an author who has captured a lot of what we'll talk about today in his books. Brad Schaeffer, welcome to Rocket Motivation Podcast.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
All right. Well, Brad, let's do this. Kind of tell us where you are now in your life, kind of where you live, family, career, kind of just catch us all up.
I'm in my mid-50s now. I've been living in a sort of a commuter town outside of New York City in New Jersey for about the last almost 30 years or so. Married. I've got 2 kids. One's in med school and one's a sophomore in college. And wife's a teacher, and I spend my days trading my money, managing my own account, which I've been doing for about over half a decade now, as well as writing articles and books and all that. And every now and then I'll pick up a musical instrument and join a band for a little bit. But this is really what I like to do. So I like to say I'm a trader who writes articles, or I'm a columnist who trades. It depends on whichever floats your boat.
I got you. Or a musician who writes and trades.
Yep, that too. Yeah, there are a lot of good musicians out there, though. So.
Yeah. Well, let's do this. Let's go back to around your 16th birthday, or even before that. I mean, let's talk about your dad and your relationship, and kind of talk us through what he went through, and then take us up through when he took his own life. But just kind of tell us that story.
Well, he was the 2nd lieutenant in the 1st Marine Division in Korea, and he was actually a bona fide combat veteran. He was wounded in action by Chinese grenades. And so as anybody listening who knows the history of the 1st Marine Division in Korea, it was a very intense duty. Let's just put it that way. And I think it affected him more than he cared to realize. And he kind of came of age in that that group who he was like, in his generation, the older brothers were the ones who went and fought World War II. And like the younger brothers, the kid brothers fought in Korea or what have you. So I think, and there was sort of a mantra back then that, that you don't really talk much about, your experiences, and you don't really, if you're feeling stressed or you're feeling anxious about what you saw, to, suck it up, buttercup, would seem to be that kind of an attitude. And which I think is a shame, because a lot of men who came back from World War II and Korea, as well as, more publicized like Vietnam and Gulf War, which I care about a lot of these guys came back with these psychological scars. Like my father's wound was relatively minor. It was one of those $1 million wounds, as they used to call them, because he got wounded in the foot and he was able to get out of there. But I think there was a bit of survivor's guilt. I think there was a bit of just not really being able to process all the things that he saw at such a young age. And his family wasn't exactly the most loving and caring family. So he really had no one to talk to. My mother and he had a very traditional marriage, and it was just a very 50s and 60s marriage, So he was one of those tough guys who came back from war and, put on a suit and tie, became an executive at a firm with other veterans. And all the while, though, I felt like this little demon was just kind of nibbling at him, because I could see as he got older, he was starting to become a little bit more erratic in his behavior, drinking a little bit more than usual, not to the point where it affected his work or anything like that. And he started talking to me as I got older about his experiences in the war, which he had never really done before when he was younger. So I think almost it was starting to, for whatever reason, whatever the timing, maybe it was a combination of that and midlife crisis or whatever it is, because he was 56 when he died. I think it boiled up inside of him, and finally just something snapped one day. I mean, he saw some pretty horrible things. And as someone who's never donned the uniform, I mean, the closest I've ever come to it is I've shot a gun once or twice. So, and I cannot imagine the experience of being in combat. And I literally can't imagine it. And I wouldn't even presume to try, even though I write about it a little bit. I do it, from a position of reverence and knowing what I don't know. And so I just think, it's just kind of a shame that back then in the 80s, which is when he died in 1983, he didn't have access to the, I think to the psychological support and even the medical support with, medications and whatnot that they have now. So, but, it was a different era. And, I think in many ways he was a casualty of war. Yeah. It just took 30 years for the bullet to hit.
Right. Well, how did you deal with that? I mean, you had just turned 16 and your father takes his own life. I mean, how did you deal with that and how did that affect you?
Well, first of all, and this may sound odd to say this, but in some ways I was very fortunate that if it had to happen to someone, it happened to me because unlike my father, I had very supportive siblings. I'm the youngest of 5. My oldest is 14 years older than me. So I was the only one in the house, though, at the time. They had all either, moved out, went to college, were going to college or moved out. I had a brother who was in the Navy at the time. I have, family in Maryland, which is where my parents originally grew up. They moved to Illinois because where I grew up because of of business reasons. But, I was 16 and suddenly it's me and my mother, my widowed mother, who's in her mid 50s. So she's in a terrible position where she is, not too old to, so she's not old. She's not at the age where she wants to just retire and eventually become a grandmother. But, she's not, in her 20s anymore. And so going out and starting over her life, was very difficult. So I spent a lot of my time really worrying about her. And I processed it, I guess, through it in my own way. I was also very fortunate that I was in a band at the time in high school, and these guys were very good friends of mine. And I had a lot of creative outlets to kind of process what was going on and do it in a healthy way, relatively healthy. I mean, I'm sure I drank a little bit more, I think, than some kids at that age, but I'd like to give myself a little break for that. But I also was fortunate that I had a very caring guidance counselor named Stan Oshevsky, who really looked out for me and in high school. So I had a really good support network. But with that being said, of course, in the still of night, when, no one's around, you lie there and you think to yourself, what could I have done? The one thing they say about suicides that is a very common refrain, especially with a man like my father, who was a very tough man, at least on the outside, was, you never think they're going to do it. So I know my mom had to process a lot of guilt, unnecessary guilt, feeling that she should have caught it. I had to basically teach myself that what happened was not an act of abandonment, that he was, which is the way it felt for a little bit, was that he was a mentally ill man. And to blame him for what happened would be no more logical than to blame somebody for having a heart attack. I always say that my father had a brain attack, that he was, so he, I think it was triggered at the war and maybe some other things in his life. And it just kind of finally came to fruition at that age. I don't think he picked my birthday as, or the days around my birthday as anything. I think, in fact, the fact that he did that tells me that he really wasn't thinking clearly, because nobody, and he loved it. He loved me, he was my father and he loved me. So he would never have done that on that day or around that day, purposely, he wasn't making a statement. I just think his mind was completely gone.
Right. Yeah.
So the latter stage of something that affected him.
Okay. I want to jump ahead to your job as a trader, but I do we will fill in these gaps though. But so when we talk about, you being a trader, and just so I want the listeners to understand, I mean, is this similar to the movie Trading Places, when you see those traders on the floor, the yelling, the screaming, the shouting, the waving the hands? Is that what you did?
Yeah, that's exactly what I did. In fact, that scene in Trading Places, in my new book, Life in the Pits, My Time in the Trading Floors, that scene I actually write took place in, I believe it was the Gold Pit in New York, because there was no frozen concentrated orange juice. But that was exactly what I did. You screamed, you yelled. It was called Open to Outcry. And it doesn't really exist anymore, except for maybe 1 or 2 residual pits left on the floor. But you were asking how one goes from what I experienced at 16 to being in that environment. And I think one had to do with the other a little bit. So when I graduated, I had the chance to go. I believe I'd had the chance, if memory serves, after 30 years, your mind plays tricks. But I do recall being able to go to one of the Eastern universities. But after my father died, we lived in a town outside Chicago, and the University of Illinois was both free because it was the son of a deceased veteran scholarship, and which my counselor had brought to my attention, and it was close to my mom, and so I didn't want to leave my widowed mother. So it's funny though, Steve Jobs, I remember in one of his commencement addresses, I don't know if he came up with this phrase or not, but he said, you sometimes can only connect the dots backwards. So the fact that my father passed away meant that I stayed in Illinois. The fact that I stayed in Illinois and went to University of Illinois meant that when I came out of college, I knew a lot of people who were who were in the trading floor because Chicago was the global seat of commodities trading, right? And so because of that, my brother had gotten a job as a trader on the floor, and I came out of college as an artist, but my brother soon recommended me to go down to the floor of the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, which is, if anybody's seen the movie Ferris Bueller's Day Off, that's the exchange that they're looking at when they're looking down, and just trying to figure out what's going on. And so I ended up, down on the trading floor. So it's weird how certain things lead up to something. And I think I did well on the floor because the jobs that I had taken after my father died to kind of help make ends meet, because my mother didn't get insurance because there was a suicide clause in it, unfortunately. So I tried to make some extra money. And so some of the jobs I had were like, there was an apple orchard near me. I shoveled compost. I used to work as a waiter. I taught physical education for mildly to profoundly, back then we called them retarded, obviously mentally handicapped, at sort of a village. So all these little jobs I had, which were sort of triggered by my father's death and me having to kind of go out on my own, what they all had in common was you had to check your ego at the door. And so that really gave me armadillo skin to go down onto the floor of the exchange, where your ego gets atomized on the first day. You can just imagine walking into one of those trading pits, and you get hit by the noise, and people are screaming and yelling, and there's literally millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars flying back and forth. And it's not a place for it's not a place for the weak of heart, or it's not a place for people who are not willing to take a lot of abuse and pay their dues. And so I think my father's death sort of toughened me up for that. So in a way, I also didn't have any real male guidance. So in a way, it was like the perfect place for me, because it was a place that was both structured yet somewhat lawless in terms of how people behaved. There were no, mores to follow. You didn't have to worry about insulting somebody. You could, it was people screamed and yelled and shoved each other, and yet we were all doing business. And so for me, it was sort of the perfect place to end up, if that makes any sense. It was like a football game, only for money.
Right. And let me ask you, from doing that job, and maybe we need to step back just real quick. Because people have seen the movie, like the Trading Places, and they've seen the Ferris Bueller, but they see all the yelling and the waving the hands. But what are you actually doing when you're doing that?
You're dealing. Well, it's like an auction, right? So when somebody screams, "Do I see a bid for this?" or whatever, and somebody raises their paddle, right? Well, we do the same thing. What used to happen before, like everything I do now is electronic, over the counter, right? I'm sitting up on a desk with my feet up as opposed to screaming and yelling. But what it used to be is you had two types of people on the floor. Really three types, but you had brokers. Those were the people who would fulfill an order. So if you were let's just use unleaded gasoline futures, which I used to trade as an example, right? If you're a refiner and you're worried about the price of unleaded gasoline going up or going down, right, which means it'll eat into your profits, you'll sell an unleaded gasoline future. If you're a producer or you're a consumer, I should say, and you're worried about the price going up, you'll buy an unleaded gasoline future. And that's just an agreement to buy or sell a certain number of gallons at a certain price at a certain time in the future. And it's a way to hedge, right? So what would happen is these guys would call into their bankers. The bankers would call onto the floor. They would call the correct pit. Each trading floor had different pits, right? Like in the Chicago Merc, I was in the Eurodollar pit, but there was also the S&P 500 pit. There was live cattle. There was pork bellies. Over the Chicago Board of Trade, there was wheat, corn, treasury bonds, all these things. Each pit had its own arena. And so these guys would call in and say, okay, let's say you went to the New York Merc and you called in this unleaded gas pit, and you go, okay, I need to buy X amount of unleaded gas. And so then the brokers would shout out, and we would scream what we were willing to pay for it, what we were willing to sell for it. And the squeaky wheel got the grease. And so we would descend on top of the broker and scream and yell. And what we did was we communicated, because it was so chaotic, through hand signals, right? And part of my job when I first went down to the floor was to learn the hand signals, which was like a language all to its own. And so what looks like chaos on the outside is people buying and selling various financial instruments, and they're just doing it, screaming and yelling. And so, like, I'd look at you and I'd go, okay, I'll sell you 50, and I'd make a waving motion. You would acknowledge the trade. We would both write down the trade, our side of it, on a card. We would send the card to the exchange, and if they matched up, we had a deal. And what was interesting is that these deals were consummated very quickly, and it was all basically done by my word. I told you I'd sell you that, and I will. And of course, if you started to back out of trades that went against you, no one would do business with you, and you'd be wiped out. But it was it was sort of controlled chaos. I always say it's like somebody watching a beehive would think it's just crazy and chaotic, but somebody who's an expert on bees, whether an apiarist or whatever, they would understand what they're looking at.
Right.
So it was, it was actually more efficient than people realize. But yes, it was very physical. I developed tinnitus very quickly. It's like people screaming in your ears, and it's like really being on a crowded subway for about 7 hours. Yeah. Like, we were so jam-packed together that if one of us turned, somebody 3 people down might pop off the step.
Yeah.
And guys would fall into the pit, and we'd step on each other, and it was kind of like a combination of Wall Street and Game of Thrones.
Yeah,
is probably the best way to describe it.
Well, what's your biggest what's your biggest takeaway or life lessons that you learned from being in that environment?
Well, number one is that the world doesn't owe you a living. Number two is that your degree and your credentials can only get you so far in life. They're a very good way to get you into the door, but once you're, in the trading floor didn't take any prisoners. It was very egalitarian in the sense that I tell people I stood next to somebody on my left who was a high school dropout tennis pro, and somebody on my right who was a Harvard law graduate, and they were both good enough at trading that they both made equal amounts of money, right? And so it taught me very quickly that there's a lot more to people's value and intellect than just their pedigree or just their degree hanging on the wall. And the trading floor was great at that. It was also very good at teaching you to very quickly make decisions. Not necessarily ready, shoot, aim, but to process information very quickly and come up with a verdict. Do I buy this or not? Do I bid this price or do I offer that price? Should I maybe avoid this trade? Should I, we used to joke that if a broker came in with an enormous order that we knew would push the markets like right against us the moment we bought it, we used to bend down and tie our shoes just as the order came into the pit. So we would pretend that we missed it, knowing that the order was coming in to just crush anybody who tried to buy these products,
Yeah.
So it taught you that. It taught me also self-discipline. The day started very early. You began trading at 7:20 in the morning, screaming and yelling. Some of the most important economic numbers that came out at 7:30 in the morning. So you had to be sharp and ready to go. And, you just had to be it taught me to be very, very disciplined and to check my ego at the door.
Yeah.
And I think if you're disciplined in life, the rest will come. And so you have no choice but to be disciplined doing what I do, or else you'll lose money very quickly.
Yeah. What did you mean when the first thing you said when I said, what are your biggest takeaways or life lessons, what you learned, was that the world doesn't owe you a living. What do you mean by that?
Yep, that's correct. Well, what I mean is, okay, I stood next to guys who, some guys who did all the right things. They went to Harvard Law. They went to, some guys went to MIT, whatever, but when they were on the floor, they didn't believe that just because of who they were or what their family was or whatever, that the world should pay them. Trading is a very honest business. The world doesn't owe you a living, but you can extract a living from the world if you're smart. So, so basically when you went down to the floor, there was no way to hide behind anything, no way to hide behind office politics. If you bought something for 10 and then you were able to sell it for 12 or 13 or 15, that you were a winner. If you bought something for 10 and then you ended up having to get rid of it at 8 or 7 or 6, you were a loser. And it didn't matter anything else. And unless you were able to master that ability to trade, to process all this information and come up with a coherent narrative in your head that made you make a trading decision that put the odds in your favor. Most trades aren't winners, but so you try to stack the odds in your favor. And unless you're able to do that, no degree is going to save you. No one's going to help you. Go to the corporate world and learn how to play golf and climb the corporate ladder by babysitting the boss's kids on a Saturday if you want to do that. But the trading floor had no time for that office politics stuff.
Right.
So
right.
You came down, you traded. If you made money, you made money. If you didn't, you're gone. Yeah. That's simple.
Well, Brad, when it was all over, because I assume this had to be, a big rush when you're doing this work. When it was all over, how did you deal with I guess your days weren't nearly as exciting or traumatic. When it was all over, how'd you deal with it when the trading floors went away?
Yeah, well, some people couldn't adapt to it. Some guys really just only knew how to stand next to their buddies and buy something for one from this guy and sell something to two for that guy. And, they didn't really, none of these guys, not none, a lot of these guys didn't really study the macro markets a little bit. And so when electronic trading hit, and really the book I wrote is sort of about being there, which was both paradoxically the apex of trading, but also the beginning of its demise, because in 1993 was the first electronic trade done over the counter in currency futures it was. And it expanded from there. And a lot of these guys basically had the floor of their careers, literally, and figuratively pulled out from under them. And I was always kind of analytical. And also I had left the floor. And so I had been over the counter brokering probably for the last 15 years or so, or the last 10 or 15 years of the floor. So I was already kind of getting acclimated to the way what we called over-the-counter traders traded. So those are like the Gordon Gekko types, the guys who come in, who work for these big banks, who do these gigantic trades. And it's a different trading environment than it was on the floor. And I was able to sort of watch it and to rewire myself to be an over-the-counter trader, which is a totally different animal. You have to have different disciplines. Personally, from a physical standpoint, I don't miss it. It was, it was not I certainly wouldn't be there at this age anyway, even if they were thriving. It was certainly more of a young man's game. But I think it's the whole nobody owes you a living, right? Suddenly guys were complaining and, saying, oh, this is not fair. We're losing our entire career because of electronic trading. And I'm like, yeah, and I'm sure that's what buggy salesmen were saying when the car came, yeah. And I'm sure that's what propeller engine guys were saying when the jet engine came. I don't know what to tell you guys. Yeah. This is progress. You can either want, and I guess this goes back to sort of what I learned about my dad, just kind of come full circle. Look, you can either sit there and whine about it and feel sorry for yourself, or you can say, okay, what am I going to do about this? What is, what is my solution? Complaining about something without having a solution or without having a game plan to get yourself out of the situation is useless. It's just a waste of energy. And so I think a lot of guys hadn't really quite learned that, but some of them adapted went to the over the counter like I am and did very well. And they run, some run a couple $1 billion hedge funds now and whatnot. So like a lot of things, progress is a blessing and a curse. And if it's the thing that's going to put you out of business, then it's up to you to learn how to either adapt with it or find something new. Again, like I said, the world doesn't owe you a living. And so the floor doesn't owe you to stay there just so you can have an easy living. Life moves on, time moves on. Yeah. And I really think that, again, with my dad, there was nothing I could do. The man was gone, the man was gone, the man was dead. I was suitably sad, but then I'm like, okay, listen, I've got a widowed mother. I've got to get my act together here because I got college coming up. I got to decide where I'm going. It's like, I've done my mourning. It's a terrible thing that happened to me, but bad things happen to people all the time. Now I got to move on. And I think, to a lesser extent, a lot of guys didn't learn that from in their trading experience. Right.
Well, Brad, what have you learned about yourself through your life and your experiences?
I'm a little bit thicker skinned than I realized. In fact, sometimes I can come across a little bit caustic to some people, but to me, it's just the way it's just the environment that I've always been in, the professional environment. And even before that, being in a fraternity, I was Rush chairman. So that definitely forces you to live with other people and to realize that you're not as important as you think you are. But it taught me that, number one, I'm pretty thick skinned. It taught me that, like I said, there's only one way to deal with the bad things that have happened in your life. And that is to do the proverbial, brush yourself off and try and move forward, And I think I've kind of done that my whole life. I feel like I've been kind of a survivor most of my life. And I think that has helped me. Major problems don't really bother me that much because I've seen also, real tragedy. And so, I don't really get too upset about a flat tire. I don't get too upset about, I don't know, if I'm out of butter and I'm about to have a really good piece of toast, little things like that don't really bother me very much.
Yeah.
To me, I'll tell you another thing it's taught me in general is that, to kind of get off on a tangent, but I'm worried about this country because of all the fatherless children out there, children growing up in a home not without their father. I mean, my father died when I was 16, and he still implanted enough of his influence in me to, at least I didn't come out of the oven fully cooked. I came out of it half baked, but I still had somebody at least kneading the dough and setting it up for me. I can't imagine, though, having never known my father, even unfortunately for the short time I knew him. He's been dead 40 years now. I just can't imagine not knowing that. Now I understand the average, almost half of the kids in the country being born right now are being born without a father figure. And I just don't see how any country can do well with that dynamic. I can tell you what I would have been if I hadn't had older brothers and sisters and guidance. So I think, so again, I guess one thing it also taught me about myself is, all in all, I feel like a lucky person, even though you'd think I got a bad break at age 16. But, look, it could always be worse, and that's the thing. And so that's one thing it taught me, too, is that, it can always get worse, and this too shall pass.
Right.
So cliches, but you know what? Some cliches work.
Yeah. Well, Brad, what advice would you give? Because, this podcast, the Rocket Motivation Podcast, it's all about, people dealing with and overcoming adversity. What advice would you give to somebody who's having a bad time, down on their luck, facing some tough times? What advice would you give to them to try to, help them pull out of it?
Well, the first thing I would do is to say, just remember, nothing is permanent. I think it was my brother, who's the pilot, who first I ever heard was through him. And he said, suicide is a permanent solution to a temporary problem. I know people get down in the dumps, and I totally get that. I've been there myself. I've struggled with depression over the years, and so I totally understand it. And it can be very insidious. So I think some advice I would give you is, number one, internally, just remember that this too shall pass. Those are the 4 wisest words ever written. And that's because it seems like things are bad, it will get better. Number 2 is, if you have access to medication, if you are, like I suffer from depression sometimes, and I can tell you, if people listening who do as well, this probably sounds very familiar. You write a matrix of your life, all the good things and the bad things, and I bet the good things outweigh the bad things 10 to 1 sometimes. And yet you still say to yourself, but why do I feel so bad? And I think a lot of that is chemical as much as psychological. I think psychological and chemical are one and the same. And had my father been more open to the idea that, listen, your brain is another organ and it's malfunctioning right now and it needs to be fixed. If my father had been open to that, he might be alive today. So there is absolutely no shame in getting help. There is absolutely no shame in getting medication if you need it. I mean, if you had high blood pressure, would you feel embarrassed to get a high blood pressure medicine? Of course not. So if you have depression and you feel it and you have it, there's nothing wrong at all with going to pharmaceuticals if you need it. I'm not one to run to drugs for any problem, but, there are certain things that, listen, when you're depressed, the worst thing is you've got your own mind boring in on you. So you have to be aware that you're in a struggle with yourself, but there is help out there. There's both help and there's relief. The relief will also come with time. That you will get through this, and one day you will. This is another cliche, but one day you will look back on all this and maybe not laugh, but say to yourself, "Wow, I got through that." Yeah. And if I can get through that, I can get through anything. Right. And you can get through anything. You really can. Sometimes you have, just remember, you don't have a choice. I mean, suicide's not a choice. Suicide it shouldn't, I can't imagine doing that. But again, I've never been in that position where like my father was, Well,
Brad, let's do this. Let's talk about your books. First of all, I mean, you became an author, tell us, what kind of pushed you in that direction. Then and talk about your books, why you wrote them and what they are.
Sure. Well, I've always been a pretty decent writer. And again, I give my older brothers and sisters credit for that because they would help me with my papers when I was in middle school. And I learned the proper format for writing. Also, my father introduced me to reading tremendously. So I was always interested in storytelling. He would sit down with me and read Zane Grey books and really cool stuff. So my family kind of always sort of put the germ of writing in me. Or the bug, I should say. And so with that, during college, I just kind of pursued it. And I'd always wanted to write a book, a novel. I tried to write one. It wasn't very good, so I threw it out. So if anybody's trying to write, Your first book's never going to seem good, but just keep doing it. Keep doing it. So the first book I wrote, my neighbor was a World War II vet. He was actually a navigator on a B-17. He was an old man in his 90s, nicest guy in the world. You'd never know he was a war hero. He'd been shot down over Bremen, was taken prisoner, and he said after the war, him and some he was in a glider club in the United States, and some German fighter pilots who had emigrated were also in the club, and they were talking to each other, and they would say, they would talk about the air combat and whatnot, like kind of almost like describing an old football game, which was kind of odd, right? When you think they were trying to kill each other. But he basically put the idea in my head. I always wondered who those guys flying those German airplanes were in World War II, right? The ones, you see the Memphis Belle and you see all these Americans, but who were the guys in the airplanes? So I wanted to write a book about that because I don't think any novel had ever been written. There have been some U-boat novels, but not that. But I wanted to write it in a way that made it so that you didn't think that that I was rooting for the Germans, of course, So I basically made it about a book about a German fighter pilot who saves a family of Jews from his hometown. So I kind of combined Schindler's List with 12 O'Clock High, and that became Of Another Time and Place. And that book actually did pretty well. So I was happy with it. So that's my war book. And then The Extraordinary was about a 14-year-old boy named Wesley who is autistic, and he's telling the story about his father coming home from Iraq with PTSD and wounded. So I basically tackled what I saw in my high school through the eyes of an autistic boy, because I wanted to tell two stories about two different pressing issues. And so that book actually hit #1 in Kindle on autism. So I was very happy. So that was called The Extraordinary. And then this book that we're discussing a little bit is my memoirs of my time on the trading floor, called Life in the Pits, My Time as a Trader on the Rough and Tumble Exchange Floors. And that basically tells you what life was like down there, how somebody like me got down there, and what was going, I was a clerk during the Gulf War and the oil pits, which was fascinating. And so I saw a couple of things, and it's just me just sort of writing my epitaph for those trading floors that are no more. So, and that seems to be doing pretty well as well. So I'm quite lucky that I can write as well as trade and do the other things I like to do. Yeah. And so that's it so far. 3 books, but I've written 5 more. So
if people want to buy your books, what's the best way to do it?
Best way probably would be to go on Amazon. Just type in Brad Schaeffer, author, not Brad Schaeffer. There's a guy named Brad Schaeffer who's a very famous, for some reason, podiatrist in New Jersey, where I live. So if you type in Brad Schaeffer, New Jersey, you'll probably get the podiatrist first. But if you type in Brad Schaeffer, author, you'll see on Amazon my books. Also, bradschaefferauthor.com is my website. You can also find me. I have a Substack called As I See It. I'm on Twitter. I'm just kind of put my toe in the water in Twitter. I think I have 170 followers, so that's not a big deal. And you can also just pull up my articles I've written in the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, New York Post, The Hill, the National Review, the Federalist, Daily Wire, Zero Hedge. So, I'm out there. Just type in Brad Schaeffer writer and they'll pop up.
That is funny, though, when you talked about the famous podiatrist, because when I was Googling you to do a little research on you, that's what popped up first.
Yeah.
Well, Brad, I want to thank you so much for coming on, man. It's been great. You've given some great advice. You've had a spectacular life. You've given some great life lessons. So it's been my honor to have you on the show. And everybody, look, if you listen to this, you can just tell by listening to Brad, these books are going to be fantastic, and especially because at least 2 of them are based on your life. And so that's
pretty much.
Yeah, you definitely want to grab those and get those and read them. But Brad, I'm not letting you off that easy, because I always give the guests the final word or the parting shot. So dig deep, give us some good stuff to take us home.
First of all, don't do buy high, sell low. You'll ride that idea right into the toilet. So don't do that. Buy low, sell high if you can. But also on a more serious note, just know that if you are suffering from, if you feel like you can't take it, there's mental illness, there are avenues out there. Especially if you're a veteran, there are avenues out there to help you. There are medications out there to help you. Reach out to family, reach out to friends. Just pull somebody you care about aside and go, listen, man, this is the way I feel and this is bad. And you will start to see how much of a difference your life being alive makes and how much people really love you that you probably don't even realize. And it'll give you the strength to go through it, and it will get better. So that's really the main thing I have to say to anybody. My father, killed himself when I was 16 years old. And here I am, 40 years later. And, and I talk about him. I think about him every day. And I think about him with love and affection and understanding. And to those who have family members who have unfortunately committed suicide or whatnot, don't be angry. Don't be bitter. Listen, they couldn't help it. If they could, they'd be here. So as you can see, 40 years later, it's still, it's still with you.
Gotcha.
But it gets better. It gets easier. It never goes away. And you don't want it to go away. I don't want to forget about my dad, but it gets easier.
Well, Brad, again, thanks so much for coming on. What a great way to end the show. And we'll be talking to you.
Hey, thank you very much for having me.
All right.
Good luck trading out there.
All right. What a great episode with Brad Schaeffer. Great life lessons and advice from someone who's lived a remarkable life. We'll see you next week for another inspiring episode of Rocket Motivation Podcast. Thanks again for listening to Rocket Motivation. I want to again thank our sponsor, my law firm, Hand, Arundel, Harrison Self, with offices in Mobile, Birmingham, Fairhope, and Athens, Alabama, and Destin, Panama City Beach, and Santa Rosa Beach, Florida. We are uniquely situated among the Southeast major law firms to provide legal direction to clients throughout Alabama and Northwest Florida. So whether you're looking for legal advice, litigators, or simply a partner you can trust, Hand, Arundel, Harrison Sale is there for you. Thank you for listening, and be sure to check out Hand, Arundel, Harrison Sale for all your legal needs. Visit our website at handfirm.com. And if you would like to get my book, Get Back Up, it's available at Amazon. Just put in Get Back Up and my name, Rod Cate, and the book will pop up. I'd appreciate it if you would subscribe to Rocket Motivation wherever you listen to your podcasts. And please rate and review the shows and spread the word about Rocket Motivation to your friends. So until next time, remember, never give up and always get back up.